Annie Jayek, welcome back to our Braiding Sweetgrass book club group. I've been gone for a few weeks and I apologize. Let's see. So we had Mother's Day and then my son had camp and I was a volunteer for that. Let me fix my camera. And then I had a week-long migraine that just ended yesterday. So I apologize. I didn't expect to be out for 3 weeks, but it just kind of happened. So I hope you forgive me. And I've been thinking about you and the book and the lessons, but just life happened. And so I hope you understand. But feeling much better. I normally don't have migraines that last 7 days. So that was a little peculiar, but I got through it. I kind of feel a little hungover. Didn't even bother with makeup today. So this is me. Just ready for our book club group, and I'm really excited. We're towards the end of the book, and we're going into the Wendigo part. And there's a lot of like people from my tribe or the Ojibwe, even Anishinaabe, won't even say Wendigo. They might say the W word if it's not wintertime, because in wintertime we believe the spirits are sleeping and you don't want to wake, bring attention, especially if they're a bad spirit. Since I'm not telling stories directly related to Wendigo and I'm just saying the name, I'm okay with that. But just so you know, if you're talking about this around Indigenous people, you may not want to say the name. So just a heads up on that before we get started. So I've already smudged. I've had a cup of tea and some water, and so I'm ready to go. Do whatever you need to get yourself centered so you're not multitasking, thinking about anything else. You're just here in the moment. We're going to take a couple big deep breaths and then we'll get started. That's great. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so let's open up our books. Get on my glasses. So we are on, so I want to read this to you. She has like the segments. She'll do a little quote or something about sweetgrass. And this just says, burning sweetgrass. A sweetgrass braid is burned to create a ceremonial smudge that washes the recipient in kindness and compassion to heal the body and the spirit. So the thing I want to say here is, so we have our 4 sacred medicines, right? We have sema, tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. And they all have different jobs, basically. Sage is to get rid of anything negative or bad or icky. So sage takes the ish away. Cedar keeps balance. So sage will take the bad away and then cedar keeps it away. It almost forms like a protection. So like if I know that I'm going into a situation, like if I have to go to a meeting and I'm scared, or let's say I'm going into an area that might have bad energy, I will put cedar in my shoes because it just keeps that, it keeps what the sage took away, it'll keep it away. Trying to find the best terms for this. Sema or tobacco is for when you want your prayers to go to Creator. We also use it for gifting to elders. We use it for to keep, like I'll have a tobacco tie, a tobacco bundle in with regalia, just to keep it sacred, that sort of thing. We put it down on the ground when we harvest something. It's like a gift back to Creator. It's a connection to Creator, right? And then we have sweetgrass, and we have to remember where sweetgrass comes from and what it means. Sweetgrass means it's Mother Earth's hair. So it's straight from a female source, our ultimate matriarch. And so it brings that sort of like balance and healing, compassion. And so when you put all the medicines together, it makes a whole, right? So and if you haven't smelled sweetgrass, so when you burn sweetgrass, it smells the same way as it does when it's not burning, just more intense. And it's a smell like you can't really, like, it's a sweet, earthy kind of smell. Like if you could, like earth and water and sweetness, it smells like Mother Earth. So she's exactly right here. So it brings kindness and compassion to heal body and the spirit, almost like as if a mother had warm and an embrace around you. That's the feeling I get from sweetgrass. So I want us to read this part of this chapter. It's on page 304, Wendigo Footprints. And I want to be respectful and careful on how much we talk about this, but I think this paragraph is important to discuss. So, Wendigo stories were told around the fire to scare children into safe behavior, lest this Ojibwe boogeyman make a meal of them, or worse, this monster is no bear or howling wolf, no natural beast. Wendigos are not born, they are made. The Wendigo is a human being who has become a cannibal monster. Its bite will transform victims into cannibals too. That's important to remember as we go through this chapter. And I'm just curious to know if you see any comparisons in life to this paragraph, but we'll continue on. Okay, so I want to go on. I feel like it's important to read more of this because it's going to tie in her point. She doesn't just talk about this to talk about it. She has a very real point, and it's super important. And one of my favorite points of this whole entire book. So she goes on to talk about starvation in winter was a reality for our people, particularly in the era of the Little Ice Age, when winters were especially hard and long. Some scholars suggest that Wendigo mythology also spread quickly in the time of the fur trade, when overexploitation of game brought famine into the villages. The ever-present fear of winter famine is embodied in the icy hunger and gaping maw of the Wendigo. As the monster shrieked on the wind, the Wendigo stories reinforced the taboo against cannibalism when the madness of hunger and isolation rustled at the edge of winter lodges. Succumbing to such a repulsive urge doomed the gnawer of bones to wander as a Wendigo for the rest of time. It is said that the Wendigo will never enter the spirit world, but will suffer the internal pain of need, its essence a hunger that will never be sated. The more Wendigo eats, the more ravenous it becomes. It shrieks with its craving, its mind a torture of unmet want. Consumed by consumption, it lays waste to humankind. But the Wendigo is more than just a mythic monster intended to frighten children. Creation stories offer a glimpse into the worldview of a people, of how they understand themselves, their place in the world, and the ideals to which they aspire. Likewise, the collective fears and deepest values of a people are also seen in the visage of the monsters they create. Born of our fears and our failings, Wendigo is the name for that within us which cares more for its own survival than for anything else. In terms of systems science, the Wendigo is a case study of a positive feedback loop in which a change in one entity promotes a similar change in another, connected parts of the system. In this case, an increase in Wendigo hunger causes an increase in Wendigo eating, and that increased eating promotes only more rampant hunger and an eventual frenzy of uncontrolled consumption. In the natural as well as the built environment, positive feedback leads inexorable to change, sometimes to growth, sometimes to destruction. When growth is unbalanced, however, you can't always tell the difference. So now you kind of have our people's view on this, on the Wendigo, and pretty much why the story was made, but also there's a lesson in it. There's a lesson in all of the stories that are told to us as children and as adults, and that our elders continue with these stories. It's not just to make children afraid to go out at night or to consume too much. It's the story of survival when it's the hunger moon and there is no food, of what is taboo, but also to give strength, the motivation to not give in, but also to find that balance of not consuming too much, because then these are the consequences. So that's what I get from this. So this far into the chapter, I'd like to know what you think. So drop it in the comments. So I feel it's important to read this next part as well. We're on page 306. The old teachings recognized that Wendigo nature is in each of us. So the monster was created in stories, that we might learn why we should recoil from the greedy parts of ourselves. This is why Anishinaabe elders like Stuart King remind us to always acknowledge the two faces, the light and the dark side of life, in order to understand ourselves. See the dark, recognize its powers, but do not feed it. The beast has been called an evil spirit that devours mankind. The very word Wendigo, according to Ojibwe scholar Basil Johnston, can be derived from roots meaning fat excess, or thinking only of oneself. Writer Steve Pitt states that a Wendigo is a human whose selfishness has overpowered their self-control to the point that satisfaction is no longer possible. No matter what they call it, Johnston and many other scholars point to the current epidemic of self-destructive practices, addictions to alcohol, drugs, gambling, technology, and more, as a sign that Wendigo is alive and well. In Ojibwe ethics, Pitt says any overindulgent habit is self-destructive, and self-destruction is Wendigo. And just as Wendigo's bite is infectious, we all know too well that self-destruction drags along many more victims in our human families as well as in the more than human world. The native habitat of the Wendigo is the North Woods, but the range has expanded in the last few centuries. As Johnston suggests, multinational corporations have spawned a new breed of Wendigo that insatiably devours the earth's resources, not for need, but for greed. The footprints are all around us, once you know what to look for. So this was important to read and go back over, because it ties in her analogy of the Wendigo to what is happening today and what we're facing, the consequences of Wendigo-like behavior, of capitalism, of corporations, of greed. And I loved that she linked all of this together. And we can see it everywhere, and we're dealing with the consequences, and just like greed and jealousy and all of those horrible negative feelings of Wendigo, of never having enough, and only thinking of oneself, not having that balance. People take down other people with them, whether it's in your own family, and it can be in the form of like the Basil Johnston. Now Basil Johnston is another favorite of mine. He's Ojibwe, and he's written several fantastic books. If you haven't read his books, look him up. Basil Johnston, he's amazing. Now I forgot where I was at. See how my brain just goes? Okay, now I know. Now I got it. So whether you're dealing with alcoholism or drugs or sex or gambling, addiction, anything in excess is Wendigo. And you see it even if you don't have those addictions. on the other part of that is the people who break apart families, whether it's mental illness or lifelong trauma that they haven't healed yet. They can go into families, whether it's through adultery or jealousy or whatever, violence. I saw that in my own family, my extended family. And they'll take down anyone around them that they can. That's possible, just because they can never get full. They can never be satiated. And it just makes them more Wendigo-like, their behavior more Wendigo-like. And like she points out here and reminds us, we all have that potential inside of us. And so it just, do we strive to find balance? Or are we going to constantly try to feed that hunger? You know, the choice is really ours, isn't it? Now this chapter is, I mean, I can read it to you, but it's not the same. You have to read this chapter. Robin Wall Kimmerer goes on to talk about how she's in a plane and she's flying over and you can see the marks of the Wendigo everywhere. Just gonna read this little part. They're everywhere you look. The stomp in the industrial sludge of Onondaga Lake and over a savagely clear-cut slope on the Oregon coast range where the earth is slumping into the river. You can see them where coal mines rip off mountaintops in West Virginia and in oil-slick footprints on the beaches of the Gulf of Mexico. A square mile of industrial soybeans, a diamond mine in Rwanda, a closet stuffed with clothes, Wendigo footprints, all. They are all the tracks of insatiable consumption. So many have been bitten. You can see them walking the malls, eyeing your farm for a housing development, running for Congress. So read this chapter. This really ties up everything, but you really have to read it yourself. But I really, really want to know what you got from this chapter, and let's discuss, because it's huge. On a grander scale, too, we seem to be living in an era of Wendigo economics, of fabricated demand and compulsive overconsumption. What native peoples once sought to rein in, we are now asked to unleash in systematic policy of sanctioned greed. I mean, she puts it in, I mean, I think every congressman, every politician needs to read this book. Every person in, but would it do any good? I don't know. Probably not. I think that's why activists really like this book too, and Native people, because we're not in power, and we won't ever be as far as activists, but we sure can make our voices be heard, right? And lead by example. That's the thing, we have to lead by example. Okay. The U.S. National Economic Council issues such statements as, there are no limits to the carrying capacity of the earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. The idea that we should put limits on growth because of some natural limit is a profound error. Our leaders willfully ignore the wisdom and the models of every other species on the planet, except, of course, those that have gone extinct. Wendigo thinking. So that's the end of that chapter. We'll go on to the next chapter. But it's one of my favorite chapters, and it's deep, and it really gets your activist spirit going, doesn't it? And to want to make changes. So I'd really like to know what you thought about that specific chapter, Footprints of the Wendigo. So drop it in the comments. And just know in the future, especially if you come across a very traditional Anishinaabe person, they don't like to talk about, and they'll even call it the W word. So just so you're aware, not everyone will even discuss it. But this is something that you can discuss and think about for yourself, and what changes, if any, you think you should be making. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Sacred and the Super Fund. On page 310, 311. I just want to read this one paragraph on 311. It kind of brings us back and reminds us of what she's already talked about. Let's see. let's see. And so the Hadanuse were given the Thanksgiving address to remind themselves to greet and thank all of the members of the natural world whenever they gathered. To the waters, they say, we give thanks to all the waters of the world. We are grateful that the waters are still here and doing their duty of sustaining life on Mother Earth. Water is life, quenching our thirst and providing us with strength, making the plants grow and sustaining us all. Let us gather our minds together, and with one mind, we send greetings and thanks to the waters. These words reflect the sacred purpose of the people, for just as water was given certain responsibilities for sustaining the world, so were the people. Chief among their duties was to give thanks for the gifts of the earth and to care for them. So again, Robin is bringing in the Thanksgiving address by the Hadanuse. So if you don't know, the Hadanuse is the real term for the Iroquois. And that everything that we do as a people, not just Indigenous people, but is to acknowledge those that keep us here and sustain us, like water, the land, the food, the medicines, instead of just taking like the Wendigo. So giving that thanks and the gift of reciprocity, she's bringing that all back into the source of this book, and basically life, or if you want to live in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the planet and with each other. Stories are told of long ago times when the Hadanuse people did forget to live in gratitude. They became greedy and jealous and began fighting among themselves. Conflict brought only more conflict until war between the nations became continuous. Soon grief was known in every longhouse, and yet the violence went on, all were suffering. And it's almost like a cycle that we repeat and repeat. Like right now, there's the conflict that's going on between the Palestinians and Israel. And I see a lot of parallels between what Indigenous people, our ancestors, went through as far as colonization and removal, as the Palestinians are having to deal with. And in a way, I can really relate to the Palestinians, and my heart goes out to them. But then it's just more war and more war. And when does it end? Who's right and who's wrong, and who's going to stop it? Like really stop it, you know? So it's almost like we're in these endless cycles, and until we really learn from it, it's never going to stop. I hope you continue to read that chapter, but because she goes on to explain that there was a peacemaker born in the Hadanuse tribe about the time of Hiawatha, the real Hiawatha, and then they went around traveling to bring peace to all the tribes. And then the great Hadanuse Confederacy, or the Iroquois Confederacy, the oldest living democracy on the planet, was born at Onondaga Lake, where this great law was born. For its pivotal role, the Onondaga Nation became the central fire of the Confederacy, and from that time forward, the name Tadodaho, I know I butchered that, has been carried by the spiritual leader of the Confederacy. As a final measure, the peacemaker placed the far-seeing eagle atop the great tree to warn the people of approaching danger. For the many centuries that followed, the eagle did its work, and the Hadanuse people lived in peace and prosperity. But then another danger, a different kind of violence, came to their homelands. The great bird must have called and called, but its voice was lost in the maelstrom winds of change. Today, the ground where the peacemaker walked is a Superfund site. There are 9 Superfund sites, I didn't know that line the shore of Onondaga Lake, around which present-day city of Syracuse, New York. I thought that was really interesting, and it's hard to not find the sorrow, because like when I go and visit Lake Michigan or Lake Erie, you see all these factories and corporations right on the water, and you know that the pollution and the destruction that it causes. And I can't help but feel so helpless because there's nothing that this one person can do. And you also long for being able to visit the way that it's supposed to be, the way that it once was. I don't know, that's just me. I'd like to know how you feel about that though. So this is kind of a long chapter. So I'm not going to go over everything, but if there's something I missed, please, bring it up and we'll talk about it. But I do want to read this. I'm over on page 318. It goes into 319. When George Washington directed federal troops to exterminate the Onondaga during the Revolutionary War, a nation that had numbered in the tens of thousands was reduced to a few hundred people in a matter of 1 year. Afterward, every single treaty was broken. Illegal takings of land by the state of New York diminished the Aboriginal Onondaga territories to a reservation of only 4,300 acres. The Onondaga Nation territory today is not much bigger than the Solvay waste beds. Assaults on Onondaga culture continued. Parents tried to hide their children from Indian agents, but they were taken and sent to boarding schools like Carlisle Indian School. The language that framed the great law of peace was forbidden. Missionaries were dispatched to the matrilineal communities in which men and women were equals to show them the error of their ways. Longhouse ceremonies of Thanksgiving, ceremonies meant to keep the world in balance, were banned by law. The people have endured the pain of being bystanders to the degradation of their lands, but they never surrendered their caregiving responsibilities. They have continued the ceremonies that honor the land and their connection to it. The Onondaga people still live by the precepts of the Great Law and still believe that in return for the gifts of Mother Earth, human people have responsibility for carrying the non-human people, for stewardship of the land. Without title to their ancestral lands, however, their hands were tied to protect it, so they watched, powerless, as strangers buried the peacemaker's footsteps. The plants, animals, and waters they were bound to protect dwindled away, though the covenant with the land was never broken. Like the springs above the lake, the people just kept doing what they were called to do, no matter what fate met them downstream. The people went on giving thanks to the land, although so much of the land had little reason to be thankful for the people. I think this is really important because that's one thing that all Indigenous people have in common with. Our stories are pretty similar. We all faced removal. We all faced genocide. Maybe in different times because contact was different for everyone. But we all have that in common. And I think that's why Native, and it's interesting, like in social media, if like a racist or someone who doesn't understand comes after someone in the Native community, it doesn't matter which nation the other Indigenous people are from, everyone comes together to protect that person. And so in that way, I'm very grateful for my Indigenous relatives because no matter what happens, I know that even if we've never met in person because they're a totally different nation, they're going to have my back. And the same thing goes for them. And it has been hard, and that generational trauma has bled through into my family as well. Of being bystanders, of watching your land that you've taken care of for generations be stomped on, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I love that Robin again brings this up, and we're discussing things that are really hard to talk about. My dad is not Native. His ancestry is very white. My uncle, his brother did a DNA test, and it's all Scotland, all the UK, just all right there. And he marries my sweet mom, and but I have to reconcile with that as well. I'm not 100%, even though I don't believe in blood quantum. My parents weren't both Indigenous to Turtle Island. And so part of me is very much colonizer blood, just as it is Indigenous blood, you know? So we all kind of have our own balancing to do, our own reconciliation to do as well, right? It's not just them versus us, it's all us that we have to figure out what we're doing. Now, I love this paragraph. I want to talk about it. Generations of grief, generations of loss, but also strength. The people did not surrender. They had spirit on their side. They had their traditional teachings, and they also had the law. Onondaga is a rarity in the United States. A native nation that has never surrendered its traditional government, never given up its identity, nor compromised its status as a sovereign nation. Federal laws were ignored by their own authors, but the Onondaga people still live by the precepts of the Great Law. Out of grief and its strength has come a rising power, a resurgence that became public on March 11, 2005, when the Onondaga Nation filed a complaint in federal court with the goal of reclaiming title to their lost homelands, that they might once again exercise their caregiving responsibilities. While elders passed on and babies became elders, the people held to the dream of regaining their traditional lands, but they had no legal voice by which to do so. The halls of justice were closed to them for decades. As the judicial climate gradually changed to permit tribes to bring federal suit, other Haudenosaunee nations filed claims to recover their land. The substance of these claims was upheld by the Supreme Court, which ruled that Haudenosaunee lands were illegally taken and the people greatly wronged. Indian lands were unlawfully purchased in contravention of the United States Constitution. New York State has been ordered to forge a settlement through remedies and reparations have proven difficult to find. So this was huge, and it's still ongoing, of course, because people don't give up their greed and their stuff so easily. But it's a step in the right direction. To even be heard was huge, you know, and having Deb Haaland now first in as a representative, and now she's over our national parks and Indian land is huge. So times are changing. Our voices are not 100% ignored anymore, nor are we 100% invisible anymore. Just like when I was a kid, I was terrified to tell people I was Native, and I would hide it the best I could, and I would hide my mom the best I could. I'm not proud of it as an adult, but it's something I did for survival. And I love that we don't have to be scared anymore. I can come out and say who I am. And my daughter, who's turning out to be way more traditional than I've ever thought to be, is making me so incredibly proud because she has embraced it so much, and she's learning the language, and she's doing amazing things with it. Something I would have never had the courage to do as an adolescent growing up in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. So change is happening. There's a lot to this chapter. There's just not a time to go over everything, but I want to finish with this. Joanna Macy speaks of the great turning, the essential adventure of our time, the shift from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. Restoration of land and relationship pushes that turning wheel. Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it is not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. The last stop on the ride around the lake hasn't been finished yet, but the scene is planned. In this tableau, there will be kids swimming, families picnicking. People love this lake and take care of it. It's a place for ceremony and celebration. The Haudenosaunee flag flies alongside the stars and stripes. Folks are fishing in the shallows and keeping their catch. Willow trees bend gracefully, their limbs full of birds. An eagle sits at the top of the tree of peace. Lakeshore wetlands are rich with muskrats and waterfowl. Native prairies green the lakeshore. The signpost at the scene reads, "Land as home." Now that's a beautiful place to stop. I'd really like to know what you think about that, and if you really think we're coming to that reconciliation part in civilization where we can find that balance and harmony again. Do you really think we're there? Are we close? Is it attainable or is it not? Is it fleeting? I'd really like to know your thoughts on that. And with that, I'm going to leave you. Fairly short today, but I think these are really deep chapters that we need to do a lot of thinking about. Now, we are going to be finishing up next week with this book. It's kind of sad to see it go, and I'll read it again. I'm really looking forward to my husband reading this. So we'll be ending this next week. It'll be our last episode, and then I'm going to do a fairly short book club on heartberries. So if you haven't gotten that yet, and I don't have the copy near me, but I'll show it next week. And then I think we might take a break for the summer. I'll show you my reading list for the summer because we'll start back up in the fall again with more book clubs. And if you hear of any books you think that we should have a book club with, let me know. Because I've really enjoyed doing this. I started this as something to keep me connected during the pandemic. And even though the pandemic is thankfully starting to wrap up and we're getting back to normal, I think I might continue this. I've really enjoyed this and I've gotten to know so many amazing people. So I'm very, very grateful. And I look forward to our next session and finishing up this book and really knowing what you all thought of this book. It's definitely in my top 3 favorite books of all time. So I hope you have a wonderful week. I do plan on being back on Monday. So we'll see you next Monday and we'll be finishing up this amazing book. Thanks for everything. Miigwech. Bama P. For every Indigenous Author Monday video that I put out, I am dedicating it to the One Shelf Project put on by Gadakana. Gadakana is an Indigenous organization, a 501c3 nonprofit, tax-deductible organization that provides books in their local libraries that are actually accurate, historically accurate, and by Indigenous authors, both fiction and nonfiction. And their goal is to at least have a shelf dedicated to Indigenous accurate information in their local libraries. They can only do this with help through donors, and they need your help. I will put the link down here, so please check them out. The One Shelf Project, another organization near and dear to my heart. Gadakana.